This is Mondale's second visit to Oregon during the presidential campaign, and it points to the state's Carter campaign's efforts to hold on to its ever-shrinking lead over the Republicans. The vice presidential candidate was met at the airport by some of his more prominent supporters in Oregon. The prominence gave way to enthusiasm at a tent meeting near Madison High School. Mondale's speech kicked off a caucus of Democratic county chairpersons who are meeting to assess just how well the Democratic ticket is doing in this state.
That you're about to make this state go for the Carter ticket on November 2nd. I can see that.
Mondale could not resist talking about the environment to the Oregon crowd, but the bulk of the speech attacked the administration's economic policies. His remarks follow yesterday's commerce report that showed the gross national product in the last quarter rising by a disappointing 4%.
This country needs a president who will make this economy work to produce jobs and to end inflation. We cannot solve this nation's problems unless everyone who wants a job can get one, and unless a dollar once earned is worth a dollar.
There were a handful of picketers in the crowd who were a part of that unemployment figure. They would sporadically chant, "We want jobs, not hot air." Mondale was in Portland for less than 2 hours and was quickly on his way to Seattle. But before he left, he held a brief news conference at the airport. Mondale was asked about another presidential candidate who was in Portland tonight. Will Eugene McCarthy take away vital votes from the Democratic ticket?
We think that voters are very practical, and they realize that there's only one of two persons who could possibly be elected president, Mr. Carter or Mr. Ford.
This is Sam Thomas for Channel 8 News from the airport.